To take us through this educational session, let's hand over to our celebrity speaker, Douglas.
Fantastic. Well, folks, if you are here after joining me for the Cape Town session, please don't worry. You will hear a couple of ideas tonight that are repeats of before, but it is not the same session by any means. So we are after an interesting goal. How do you become iconic by design? What can you do as a conscious choice in order to be something unique, something distinctive, something completely different in the market? And what I'd like to provide you with tonight are 7 searching question suggestions that I hope you will be able to mull over the course of the next few days, perhaps the next few weeks, and which will give you a little bit of sort of productive, fruitful ways of considering, thinking about how you can stand out and how you can be something unique. And we're doing this in the form of a sort of an informal seminar style. So I'll chat you through some of the ideas, but in each case, I'm going to turn it back to you as a challenge. Here is the first of our 7 searching question suggestions, and they all come in the form of what's. What is your avatar? What is the avatar by which you personally are inspired to do what you do? Now, let me give you a couple of examples of this one because it's a bit of an abstract idea and not one I think that we hear discussed terribly often. And there is much to be found in this one. The deeper you go, the deeper it becomes. So let's start off with a speaker that many of you may have heard of by the name of Randy Gage. Randy is one of the, perhaps the top booked speakers, and over the past few years has been one of the highest earning speakers around the world. And I had the opportunity of seeing Randy present in Dallas, Texas. And he said something that jumped out at me because I've been mentally shopping for this idea. And it was this concept of his own self-image, how he sees and how he thinks about himself. And in his case, he says, when he's backstage and he has this moment of preparation, that moment of privacy, he kind of mulls over the flavor, the idea of Miami Vice. You might remember the old TV show, Miami Vice. And to Randy, Miami Vice sums up and embodies this concept of ease, cool, and calm control. And that to him is his way of expressing his own persona. Now, we're not talking about getting rid of your personality here. We're not talking about doing anything inauthentic. In fact, what we're looking for is the thing that most lights you up. So that's his one. And I've been looking for, and as I say, mentally shopping for this quality in top icons around the world. In 2 of my books on expert positioning, I express this idea in differing ways, and I invite you to consider what your ideal, your avatar might be. I love talking about Nigella Lawson's show. My wife and I watch her show religiously, but for vastly different reasons. And Nigella once expressed this idea so well in quite a revealing interview with Time magazine. It was this sort of moment of humility where she gave away something of herself. They asked her the question, what inspires you to do what you do and to be who you are? And it took her a few seconds of mulling this one over before she said, you know, when I was about 17 years old, I had this romantic, idealized image of an Italian goddess. And she waxed lyrical about that for a while. She spoke about how this image in her mind summed up finesse and elegance and sensuality. Now, of course, Nigella herself is as English as they come. But when you view her show and you see anything that she does and think about it through the framework of that idea, you can see it everywhere. Now, of course, what that does is it elevates what she does from the level of sharing recipes to the level of creating identity. And that is something vastly different and in part accounts for her distinctiveness in the global market. There are people who are technically more qualified chefs than Nigella, and she's out earning all of them combined. And much of that has to do not with the food, but with the persona. There is something that lights her up and it translates into everything that she does. So the question becomes, What does that for you? Another example of this one, I spend half of my life listening to audiobooks. I'm absolutely addicted to the medium. And I just finished a book by an English philosopher by the name of Sir Roger Scruton. Quite a remarkable man. He just passed away in the past few weeks, in fact, and he was knighted for his services to humanity. Now that's quite something for a philosopher. So, given that level of intellect, we're clearly talking about a very serious-minded man, and yet you hear the same dynamic from him as well. In an interview, he said, you know, the picture that drives me is this image of the English country gentleman. Now, who knows why, but that lights him up, and that inspires him to do what he does. It in no way changes his content. It merely affects the tone, the flavor by which he delivers it. And in as much as he drives that out into his content, into his delivery, into his writing, it imbues it with something a little unique. So this is an abstract idea, but it is an immensely powerful one. And the question, of course, then for you becomes, what is your avatar? The danger zone to this one is to say, I'm going to copy that individual. You simply cannot do that and be unique by definition. The invitation instead is to ask yourself, what lights you up? Can you show your tribes of followers how to be a certain thing, above and beyond simply delivering the information that you deliver? Now, that can be anything. For you, it might be George Clooney smooth, or it might be Jeremy Clarkson buffoon. Whatever it is that works for you, what you want to do is consciously imbue that into your work. The reason I bring this one up as an abstract idea right from the beginning is that we are speaking about distinctiveness, and that doesn't necessarily need to apply strictly at the level of your content. It begins at the level of who you are. So what lights you up, and what could you imbue into your work as your distinctive persona? What is your avatar? Now that's the idea that we covered with the Cape Town group just a couple of days ago, and after this point we begin to depart from what we chatted about the other day and go in different directions. We did mention the next one very briefly in passing. Question number 2, the challenge is, what is your cause? Now folks, I invite you to think for just a second about the speech that you deliver. Alright, now let's put that aside mentally and ask a different question. What does it change in the world? If what you do succeeds, how does the world look different tomorrow? Having a certain cause, a mission underpinning the thing that you do dramatically changes the driving energy. It changes the nature of your content, it changes your energy, and also, and this is wonderful for us, it changes the effectiveness of your marketing. In the simplest sense, you go from being perceived as a vendor of a product to being perceived as a champion of a lifestyle, of an identity, of a cause. So a couple of examples just to clarify this one. Possibly the most simple one to think of would be Gordon Ramsay. Gordon Ramsay, the angry English chef, and there is an avatar, there is an identity for you right there. Gordon Ramsay has championed various food-related causes. So, in fact, has his counterpart. Now, I'm thinking my way through names here. It's Gordon Ramsay. It's Jamie Oliver. Jamie Oliver is perhaps a more subdued, bloke-next-door kind of personality. But in both of their cases, we see them in the public forums. We see them championing causes that are food-related. It might be things like changing nutrition around the United States. It might be things like championing better food at schools. It might be Gordon Ramsay going into a hotel and shouting at people until they raise their standards. In each of these cases, it goes beyond the level of information delivery. They're not just disseminating ideas. They're not just sharing recipes. They are, in fact, championing a different world. And that changes things for you. It changes that level of energy. Another good example of this one, I'm a great fan of an economist. What a sexy thing to say. My favorite economist, hey baby, is a gentleman by the name of Thomas Sowell. The surname is spelled S-O-W-E-L-L. And he is an economic historian, which is to say he does very much what Conrad touched on, this idea of looking at big forces throughout history and asking questions about where trends originated and what things impact upon society and how you can change them for the better. And Thomas Sowell has realistically one idea underpinning some 40 years of intellectual production. He has written books on it, he delivers speeches on it, he speaks at the highest levels on this one simple concept, and that is this. His contention is that we should judge policies by their outcomes and not by their intentions. Simple as that. But that is the genesis, the basis, the energy that underpins everything that he does. It comes from that simple idea. And he points out that it's very easy for leadership groups, politicians, and so forth to say kind words and to create kind tableaus. And he says, very often, what they propose does more harm than good. But we continue to judge the ideas based on the intention and not the outcome. So as I say, 40 years worth of productivity and of expert positioning based on one simple underpinning cause that he champions in the world. Now, once again, let me return you to the level of your content. What do you speak about and what does it change in the world? What is the underlying ethos, the driving energy, the innovating root cause, and what would the world look like tomorrow if your idea won? If you start thinking about it that way, again, it elevates you from the level of being a product provider and positions you as a champion of a cause. It changes your energy. It also gives you opportunities from a marketing and positioning perspective. Because once you're clear about the cause that you champion, you can bounce that off current events. Now, in exactly the same way that we saw Conrad ingeniously bounce humor and concepts off the COVID-19 crisis, which is a foil against which to develop the humor, you can take your cause and you simply let it react to what the world is doing right now. And you can do that proactively as a thought leader. For example, you might write articles on the topic. You might create YouTube videos, you might create entire new presentations, and in doing so, you speak to the media. You volunteer your thought leadership and you go first. The whole idea of expert positioning is that ultimately, when done right, the media, the business, and the deals start coming to you. But initially, we have to go first. We have to tap on doors, we have to volunteer ourselves, and we have to say, may I speak for your audience on these concepts? Having that cause provides you with the impetus, the momentum, frankly, the excuse to do so. So what is your cause, and how can you be teaching, guiding, coaching people as a result of that? And combining it with a previous idea, bringing in that persona in order to guide them to be who they want to be. And as the 3-year-old gets hauled off to bed, kicking and screaming, let me take a sip of what I'm going to close my eyes and pretend very hard is Merlot, but is in fact a cup of sadness and disappointment. We ran out a couple of weeks ago. So question number 3. Number 1, what is your avatar? Number 2, what is your cause? Number 3, what is your zag? Let's talk about contrarianism. There is a gentleman in the United States, a speaker named Joe Calloway, who uses this idea and has a book by the topic of becoming a category of one. It's very similar to Seth Godin's idea of the purple cow, which is to say, designing something that is unique on purpose. It is structured to be different from the word go. This is an immensely challenging idea for anyone in any industry and for the most human of reasons. When we enter an industry, our heart's desire, the most natural reaction, is to want to fit in. We want to look like everyone else on the grounds that that gives us credibility. It is not a bad instinct, and in fact, when we're starting out, it's a good way to learn the basics of the world around us, of our field, of our practice. However, beyond a certain point in time, we have to let go of that. We have to go the purple cow route. We have to try to become a category of one by design. Could you be a contrarian? This requires courage. It requires that you have the kind of thick skin that says, I don't care how many dislikes I get on my YouTube videos. And there's actually a very sound principle at the heart of this one, which is just the marketing idea that you do not have to be all things to all people. There is no imperative for you to please everyone all the time. And the more you please your group of people, the more you speak strong and lead people in one singular direction. On the one hand, yes, the more polarizing it can be. On the other hand, the more you become their champion. And Seth Godin explores this one as well and makes the point that it is more powerful to be a strong leader to your tribe than it is to try to please everyone broadly. So this idea of being a contrarian, what is your zag? When everyone else zigs, how might you zag on purpose? Alan Weiss is very good at this one. Alan Weiss, again, a US speaker and coach. If you haven't read his book, $1 Million Speaking or $1 Million Coaching, two separate books, please do make a point of getting hold of them. Alan Weiss being a somewhat sort of snarky New Yorker, it's well worth getting the audiobooks if you can, because it brings across that unique kind of pushy New York flavor. And there's something wonderful about it. He has his own unique charm. And he says from the word go, he positioned himself as a contrarian on purpose. Which is to say that when trends like Six Sigma came out into the industry, he looked at that and watched everyone jumping onto the bandwagon and said, all right, what do I do that is not only not that, but something that goes in the opposite direction? And that has stood him well over the course of many decades. So Alan Weiss in his book, $1 Million Speaking, $1 Million Consulting, and I think he's even got one called $1 Million Contrarian, well worth a look as well. The books are not on sale in South Africa. If you want the hard copy, the paperback version, you have to have them brought in from the United States, but well worthwhile. It begs the question, do you need to be loved? That's a difficult one to wrestle with. And I think for a lot of people who go into the speaking arena, myself included, you put your ego on the line and you are there to be judged in ways that are unique to us. Not everyone has the strength to stand up on a stage and be visibly judged, have your voice judged, have your ideas, or almost your own identity judged by a group of strangers. The question is, do you care about negative feedback? In many cases, it is not real. And that's a hard one to get your head around. But social media responses, bad responses from people who are not your tribe of followers, are a fiction in a sense. They don't actually have a bearing upon your life unless you allow them to. So do you have the strength to zag when others zig? That's our question number 3. Number 4, what is your splash? What's the big showy thing that you do that creates a meteorite strike of awareness in the industry for your name, your brand, your business? Let's think about this one in a couple of different ways. Elon Musk, we'll pick on him for example. I'm quite a fan of his sort of originality and his strength in speaking out. Even if the man named his child Space Monkey, Spanish Flu, Xeno, Spanner, something down those lines, there is a great deal of courage and originality there. When we go back to the beginning of Tesla, this is a brand that launched into the United States and has been the only successful new automotive brand in America in over a century. That is a remarkable feat. And from the word go, he did something counterintuitive. The safe move would have been to create the sedate, sensible sedan and to try to get a large base with very little risk. Elon Musk went the opposite way. He decided to create the sexy sports car first. He did it for the splash value. Now, the next thing that he did, of course, was he created that Cybertruck. And I mean, that was just about a year ago. And the thing looks, it looks like nothing you've ever seen before, unless you have watched the sci-fi movie Blade Runner, in which case you're very familiar with it. But there is something so outstandingly original about it that you can see he's doing it by design. Now, as a sort of a sideline departure on this one, California is in lockdown at the moment. And Elon Musk actually tweeted that he was going back to work. And he said he'll be on the front lines. And if they're going to arrest anyone, please start with him. And the Californian authorities actually backed down in the face of this one. And you have to ask yourself, had Elon Musk been an anonymous soup maker, would he have gotten away with that? And I think the reality there is that he is able to push boundaries like that because he is Elon Musk. And that in no small part is the power of expert positioning and of being a standout contrarian brand. So the question is, what is your splash? What are you doing that is unusual, that is magnificent, that has public appeal? Is there something that you can do of this nature? Folks, if you're friends with me on social media, you might know I had one of these very kindly thrust upon me And it wasn't actually of my design a little while ago. Penguin asked me to write this book responding to how small businesses can survive during the COVID-19 lockdown. And it had to be written within 1 week flat. They then passed it on to Penguin in the UK, who then sold it globally. And I can't take credit for that one because it was not my initiative, but having positioned myself as that writer, I was very fortunate, very blessed to be asked to do that one. So, what splash can you create by design? Is there something that you can do that pushes boundaries, that elicits media coverage, that gets you into the Guinness Book of World Records? Could you speak longer than anyone else has spoken before? Something that you could do on purpose in order to stand out. That's idea number 4. Number 5. This is one of my favorites. What is your framework? A framework is your unique way of organizing and presenting your body of material. And in almost every case where we have a world-famous New York Times #1 best-selling author, speaker, or coach, there is almost always a powerful framework underpinning the ideas. So, for example, one of the most famous ones would be Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Kiyosaki. How many hundreds, how many thousands of books have been written on the topic of personal wealth? And yet if we say Rich Dad, Poor Dad, people have heard about that all around the world. It is one of the most famous frameworks of all time. One of the best-selling books of all time, or perhaps we should say book brands, is Chicken Soup for the Soul. And when you think about that, what is that other than a clever framework for a set of nice stories? It's really just feel-good essays and feel-good stories, but they're all united under this recognizable brand framework, Chicken Soup for the Soul. When I started out in the speaking industry, it's now about 17 years ago to my own great amazement, the first presentation I ever did was called The Rules of Hamster Thinking. And The Rules of Hamster Thinking was a very basic take initiative speech. Hamster thinking was all about thinking small, and by exploring the rules of hamster thinking, I encouraged audiences to think outside of the hamster wheel and to think in more creative and lateral ways. And that simple little framework was enough to underpin the first 4 or 5 years of my speaking career. So let's go back to your presentation again, your topic matter, the book that perhaps you're playing with writing. Is there a clever framework that sums up the entire thing in one go, that does not sound academic in nature, that people can look at, read, hear, and just get straight off the bat? Something that sums up the entire thing in one go and makes your idea come alive. Those frameworks are immensely powerful. And if you happen to be fortunate enough to have set up a framework that allows for future speeches or allows for future books, so much the better. You can even, if you're clever with your branding, you can use frameworks to position a negative or a weakness as a positive. And I think Jaguar, the automotive brand, did a genius job with this one. Their XJ, the large sedan, competes with the 7 Series and the S-Class Mercedes-Benz. Except that it doesn't. They don't sell in the same kinds of numbers anywhere around the world. So what did they say? Instead of saying, Jaguar XJ, we can't sell the way 7 Series does, they said, rare and meant to be. Now that's a mark of genius there. They took their greatest weakness and positioned it as something elite, something sexy, something that sets you apart if you buy into the brand. So this idea of frameworks again goes back to the avatar of identity. Who are you? What underpins your ideas? What makes you unique? And can you say it in poetic ways? The best frameworks are not complicated. They are a simple little metaphor that help people to just get what you do and who you are. What's your framework? Question number 6. What is your next big one and when are you going to do it? So as speakers, we know by now that the big positioning milestones, the underpinning, the pillars of credibility in our industry tend to be fairly straightforward things. They are writing the book, they are landing the television show, they are perhaps speaking on one of the big international stages, things of that nature. I would like to ask you which one you've been toying with for a while now and whether you can lower the bar in your own mind. Allow me to explain what I mean by that one, and we'll take the idea of writing a book. For most people, the concept of writing a book is it's something that they're going to do one day in the distant future. It's like this kind of nebulous mountain beyond the mists that they will climb when they are older, wiser, and guru-like. I like to look at the idea of writing a book as being the same as writing a long essay. And what that does is it lowers the bar, it lowers the barrier to entry in your own psyche. Now, that's not to say that you go ahead and write a bad book or a cheap book or an under-processed book. It is to say that you bring the mountain closer. You decide consciously that that big someday goal is something you're going to attack this week, and you take it back to its first step and you do it. When I was young and my dad wanted me to do the dishes, he was my original motivational speaker and he had his own agenda. I used to sort of stare at this pile of dishes and you could see the hopelessness mounting behind the eyes. And he would say, don't think about it, pick up the first spoon and wash it. And as self-interested as his advice was at the time, I found it to be a brilliant way of looking at and getting your head around the scope of big projects. Don't look at the size of the scope of the thing, the scale of the thing. Take it back to its first teaspoon, pick it up, wash it. If, for example, your career would benefit from the logical next step of getting a television show, well, then your spoon is to find a programs manager and email them, and I'd like to ask you to do it tonight. Don't make it a one-day goal. Make it a thing that you start chipping away at now. So, what is your next big one and when? These are not one-day projects. They are things you can start tonight. You don't have to climb the mountain tonight. Just wash that first spoon. Question number 7 brings us to our last one. What is your capacity for industry? A lot of the time, the people who stand out in every industry around the world are not necessarily distinguished by one single moment of blazing genius. They are in fact distinguished by a body of work over the decades. Take the example of Stephen King. Stephen King is the big name in horror. Whenever I speak on expert positioning, I do a simple thing right at the beginning of my presentations where I place just the name of an industry on a screen. I say bodybuilding and the whole audience goes Arnold Schwarzenegger. I say horror and the whole audience goes Stephen King. Now that's fascinating to me because you can do it anywhere on earth and you will get the same names. Stephen King has a fascinating background from many different perspectives. He wrote under 2 names. In fact, he had the pseudonym Richard Bachman when he started out. And one of his books, The Long Walk, it's vintage Stephen King. It's creepy stuff. It'll stick in your brain for weeks afterwards. And it flopped in the US market. It sold about 20,000 copies, which by US standards, and certainly by Stephen King standards, was an out-and-out failure. Then a couple of years later, they republished the same book under the name Stephen King. And in half the time, it sold 200,000 copies. Same market, same product, same man. The only difference was the equity of that iconic name. So that's what we're after here. And Stephen King became famous initially as a result of writing Carrie, the prom queen horror story. Now I invite you to imagine what would have happened if Stephen King had written Carrie, received great praise for it, a whole lot of money, a life-changing scenario, and if he had then stopped and rested on his laurels and said, well, hand me a career, I have written my masterpiece. But he didn't. He went on to Salem's Lot. And then he went on to the next one and the next one and the next one. And we now have a body of some 40 years of production that have made him one of the best-selling authors of all time. And it picks up over time. Because of the branding, the books now outsell the earlier ones. Same thing happened to Jamie Oliver. He had written a number of cookbooks prior to one of his Christmas specials. One year he launched a Christmas cookbook and it became the fastest selling book in all of human history. It wasn't his first book, and that's the key. It's based on this body of productivity over time. My favorite sort of quote on this one is by an author from the last century named James Michener. Michener used to write historical fiction. He would start at one location at the dawn of time, perhaps in Alaska, South Africa, Israel, whatever the case might be, and he would write these long sagas leading up to present day. And in an interview once with a journalist, at a point in time in which he was churning out an average of about 7,000 or 8,000 words per day. And I paused there for a second for the writers on this group. He described it as an almost indecent display of industry. And there's something about that that gives me goosebumps. An almost indecent display of industry. And the man won an astonishing number of literary prizes and international acclaim. But once again, it wasn't based on the big thing he did first. It wasn't the first book. It was the body of work over time. So this is quite a challenging one. What's the biggest thing you've done in your career right now? Has it been writing a book? Has it been an earth-shattering presentation that made a massive impact upon the society around you? Has it been speaking on a large stage? All right, how long ago was that, and what's the plan for the next one? I was doing some sort of calculations about my own book writing, and folks, I touch type, so from a sheer mechanical perspective, I can do this fairly quickly. But I don't feel pressured when I write books, which is to say, other than the last one, which I did in 1 week flat, I don't feel internally as though I am doing this at a great pace. However, over the course of the past 10 years, I'm now up to 12 books. 2 of them are still due for release. One comes out later this year, the next one comes out in February of next year. And I look at that myself, and I'm fairly astonished by the number. But all it is slow, consistent production over time. A few months ago, well, in fact now it's a couple of years ago, Shelley Walters and I were having a discussion about things you can do to market yourself as a speaker. And we chatted about this concept of doing a daily video. And at first I thought to myself how taxing, how tiring to do a unique video each weekday. However, I've been doing it now for 2 years, and we're up to a year and a half. We're up to some 410 episodes of this thing. And what I found is exactly the same thing as the book. It is immensely difficult work for the first couple of times, and then the pace picks up and it just becomes a body of production. I've overshot my time. I'd like to leave you with one last challenge, a bonus number 8. What is your investment in your art? What is your investment in your art? How do you go beyond the sheer mechanics of what you do and make it come alive at the level of art? And one hinted away forward here, if you haven't read it yet, please pick up cognitive psychologist Steven Pinker's book, The Sense of Style, which is like saying the logic underpinning style. The Sense of Style by Steven Pinker. You only need the first 50 pages. It will revolutionize your writing and your speaking. What is your art? So, what is your avatar? What is your cause? What is your zag? What is your splash? What's your framework? What's your next big thing and when? What is your capacity for industry output? And bonus number 8, what's your investment in art? Thank you so much for your time, folks. I hope that adds some grist to the mill and something to think about over the next while.